everybody. Wanted to welcome you here today. I'm Brooke Kelly Green from the Ford Foundation. And while this event is being held here today, it is actually a really collaborative event that was led and put together by our colleagues at NCRP and Grant Makers for Southern Progress. And I just want to give a big hand to them for all of the work they're doing to really align us as funders. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Ms. Foundation, at the Novo Foundation, for being incredible allies in funding in the South and really taking a lot of leadership in this area. And I know that there's a lot of you out there in this room today who are doing the same. So thank all of you for being here and showing your interest. And lastly, but certainly not least, thank you to our grantees ahead of time who you're going to hear from today. They're incredible advocates in the fields that they work in, incredibly powerful, and people who I've personally learned a lot from. So I think that we're all excited to have them here today and have this learning opportunity for the whole room. So without any further ado, I want to bring on our colleagues from Grant Makers for Southern Progress, Latasha, and our colleagues from the National Center for Responsive Philanthropy to begin the conversation today. Janelle.
Good afternoon. This is my third time coming to New York, and it's raining every time. I don't know what's happening. And I was so excited yesterday because it was just so shiny and warm. But anyway, I'm glad to be here. Thank you all for coming. We're really excited about this conversation. It's been a long time coming in terms of I think the space that we find ourselves now, where there seems to be a growing interest about the South. And those of us from the South have a lot to share. And I think that we're in a space of willingness across the board to really work together and really explore ways that we can actually strengthen our work. So I wanted just to share a little bit about GSP, and then Janae, you can talk about NCRP. But GSP, Grant Makers for Southern Progress, is a working group of funders. We were established about 7 years ago. We're made up of national funders and regional funders who are committed to supporting structural change work in the South and saw a need to really think deeply as a group, as a working group, how could we really advance progress in the South? And what does it look like? And as funders and philanthropic institutions, what is it that we need to do? I serve as the project director. We are governed by a steering committee, which are made up of funders, both national and regional funders, and we do work throughout the 13 states in the South. So.
I am Janae Isler, and I'm the Vice President and Chief Engagement Officer at the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, which is a mouthful. But all you need to know is that I'm Janae from NCRP, and I'm very honored. I'm very honored to be here, and I feel very privileged to be in this space with all of you, and particularly the folks who traveled from the South to speak with us today. I also want to acknowledge that while I'll be talking a lot about the work that we've been doing with GSP, it's really my colleagues who have made this happen. And so one of them is Ben Barge. He's in the room there in the back. Wave, Ben. And Ryan Schlegel and Stephanie Peng are the authors of the reports that you'll be reading. And so I really wanted to acknowledge them because they worked very hard in a way that has taught NCRP a lot about how we do our work, how we partner not only with funders, but with key stakeholders who are leading grassroots and transformational work throughout the country, but especially in the South. So what we're going to do today in this conversation is Latasha and I will frame our partnership together, the partnership between our organizations and the projects. And then you'll have an opportunity to hear from folks who are doing work in the South and some funders from New York who are supporting that work and partnering with them. And then you'll have a lot of time at your tables to talk in depth with the folks who have traveled today to be with us to tell us about the powerful work that they are doing and to get deeper into the conversation. So we hope that you are enjoying the lunch and that you'll stay with us through the talking at you portion, and that you will be very transparent and vulnerable during the small group conversation. The last thing I'll say is, so I'm not Southern. I'm from DC. We're right on Mason-Dixon line. But both of my parents are from the South. And so I know from my extended family experience a lot about Southern culture. we have an agenda. We have like some very specific odd number time frames in which we're all supposed to do what we're supposed to do. That's probably not going to happen. We're going to let it flow. We're gonna follow the spirit and the energy in the room. But we are asking everyone to take responsibility as you're talking at your tables, especially to give space to one another, and particularly to give space to the people who really are experts about their communities and about what it's going to take to reach the goals that we all have for the South.
And I know you're not from the South, but anywhere where I can go and order grits, I consider that the South.
Depends on what side of town you're on. It depends on what side of town you're on. So we're going to go ahead and get started.
So we wanted just to give some background on As the South Grows report, how that came about. We decided to go into partnership with each other because we wanted to really do a deeper dive in terms of looking at the opportunity and the landscape of the South, and really thinking about when you're talking about investing in structural change, how can you do that in a way that leads to more equitable outcomes? And oftentimes, I think there are three kind of core pieces that kind of come out of the report that supports what people have been saying who are on the front lines of doing this work. One, if we want to see measurable change in the nation, you cannot do that without the South, right? It's really important. And I think along with that when you're thinking about the region, there's a lot of learning that can happen within the region that can actually help and be replicated throughout the world. Throughout the country. I think there's a lot of a context in terms of work. A lot of people who have been working in extremely intense conservative environments, and in spite of being very under-resourced and in these really intense political environments, have been able to move the ball. And I think oftentimes that gets lost, and I think in the report it lifts that up, that there is a lot of opportunity with that. The second thing I think that comes out of the report is there's a willingness and an openness to really partner with national foundations and funders, and that the South is full of resources, from regional foundations to organizations to organizers who have a wealth of information. You don't have to figure everything out. There's a wealth of information, experience that actually you can tap into, and that is fertile ground. And then the third point, and I think we'll talk a lot about this today, this is kind of one of the points that come out of this too, is in the who's leading the work. And when you look at women of color and who are actually doing the work, who are leading much of the work that's happening on the ground, and there's a particular kind of approach to leadership that they bring, a particular kind of uniqueness, a particular kind of power, and oftentimes that's overlooked or undervalued in this process. So those are just some of the pieces that I just want to raise, and then we can go into the report.
So I've been charged with sharing some data that might make us a little sad, maybe not. So even though LaTosha laid out the power, the strength, opportunity in the South, not only for that region, but for the whole country, the funding disparity to the South is extreme. So if you look here on this slide, you'll see that the Alabama Black Belt, which is where LaTosha is from, and where some very powerful work is happening, which is also sort of the birthplace of civil rights, the civil rights movement as we know it, receives $28 per person, whereas in New York City, there's almost $2,000 per person given out in grant dollars. When you look at grant dollars specifically for organizing advocacy and civic engagement, there's only 51 cents per person given out in Alabama Black Belt. When, again, you compare it to New York City, there's $203. And I want to point out the other states that are there, and then the country as a whole. Those other states are important, too, because the whole state of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, these are key states in a lot of the work that we need to see advance if we want to win on the issues that we care about. When you start looking specifically at particular groups, so particularly demographics, the disparity is even greater. So to contextualize this data, we're using the Foundation Center's database. All this data is self-reported. And when we're talking about total grant making, we're talking about any grant that has been self-reported to benefit people in these particular places, so people in these particular regions. It could be a grant to a nonprofit based in New York that is supposed to be serving people in Alabama or Eastern Kentucky. But when you look at all of that grant making, you see that only less than 5% really is going to southern states and cities, except for the Alabama Black Belt, where it's less than 10% for women and girls. Next slide. For people of African descent in Eastern Kentucky, there's 0. And I'm not sure if that 0 means a fraction of a percent that can't be measured, or if it is 0. Regardless, it's still very low. People of Hispanic descent, again, fractions of a percent. And when you think about the shifting demographics in our country, this is appalling. Because when you think about building power, when you think about engaging the people who will be our country now in the next few years, why are we not granting to those people to benefit our communities? And same with immigrants overall. For LGBTQ people, again, it's appalling. So more zeros here on this slide, and fractions of a percent for all the other regions. So all of us are in this room because, the low income slide is slightly higher. And in Mississippi, it's very high. But again, when you look at a lot of the other southern states, it's not comparable to the need that we're seeing and the way that we need to build power in order to win. So our organizations have partnered together to do this project to illuminate this data and to illuminate it in a way that tells the stories of the lived experiences of people for whom this data is relevant. The way the project is structured, you can see the regions that we have, in which we've talked to folks, in which we've interviewed people, and that we will be covering in the 5 reports that'll be released. And the goal of the project here is coming slowly and beautifully on this slide, but effectively it's to increase the amount of grant dollars that are going to the South and to increase the quality of partnerships from all funders, both Southern and national funders, with the leaders, the true leaders who are doing the real work that's going to make change.
So part of why we wanted to have this discussion, we wanted to share the report, but more importantly, we want to really be engaged in conversation around this, that this is a particular moment in time, that we do think that the South is significant, and there's a significance in terms of us thinking about our wins in the South, and that there are opportunities, and how do we take this moment to really examine and think about the work that's happening, and how do we push that forward? Okay.
So we wanted to hit 3 main points. Oftentimes when we've been speaking to funders in the course of this project, we hear that people make funding decisions because they want to secure needed wins for equity. We all are down for that, right? We all agree? Okay. I mean, do we? Are we down for that? Are we down for that? Okay. So that's our intent. However, the way in which funders do that grant making has impacts that limit what change can be, because we in the sector may provide very narrow definitions. So instead, what leaders have told us through the course of the research for this project is to build long-term power. So instead of defining narrow short-term limits, build long-term power. Next slide, Ben. So another key point from the research is around leadership and capacity. Oftentimes, the intent is to get money to people who know how to use it very quickly. And so know how to use it is defined as people who write really good grant proposals, who speak our jargon, who understand our language and the culture of philanthropy. And what people have told us through the course of this research is to really value organizing skills that may look different from our own existing definitions of organizing, instead of simply grant-seeking skills or using the language that we're familiar with. Next. And then a third big theme in our research was risk. It's something that we talk about a lot in philanthropy. So when funders are calculating risk, they want to say we need to see impact in a year, 18 months, 3 years, maybe 5 years if we're lucky. But in doing so, it can overlook things that are unfamiliar to philanthropy, unfamiliar to funders. And so what folks have told us is to prioritize relationships and trust existing networks, which may take longer and may look different from what we expect, but in the long term has a deeper, more sustainable impact. And then as we get ready to prepare for our next conversation, just kind of recap some of the
just to pull out some additional points, I often think about, as we're talking about the work, we're thinking about the work doing in the South, and we talk about leadership and capacity. But how do we, I think there's a question around how do we invest in the people who are actually leading this work? And we see a disconnect from actually the investment going to the people who are on the front lines of leading this work, investment in their own personal development, investment. I know so many women in the South who are leading this work who are dealing with major health issues. Some of them are leading this work and don't even have health care themselves. Some of the women that are doing this work, yet I see in other industries, I can witness in other industries that the leadership gets invested in. So I think it's really an opportunity for us to really think about how are we not just piling on additional work for people who are leading this work, but how are we actually investing in the development of the leadership of the people who are actually doing that work. So I hope that as we're thinking about leadership and capacity building, it's in a more expanded, broader context. With that being said, thank you, Janae. With that being said, I want to move to our next section to really talk about the opportunities in working with the role of Southern funders. And with that being said, I'm going to ask Justin Maxson to come join me on stage. Justin is the executive director of the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, one of the few regional foundations in the South. I think you all have 13 states.
11.
11 states. 11 states
y'all.
that you cover.
Good afternoon.
And so just kind of jumping right into the conversation, what I really wanted to kind of talk to you about is because of as a regional funder, Babcock Foundation as a regional funder, and we're talking about this issue around kind of equity, gender and race equity. I'm interested in you kind of sharing what has been Babcock's approach to supporting the work, particularly in the South, from a gender and race equity frame.
Sure. So it's great to be here. A lot of important people in the audience. It's a great conversation, and it's a complicated conversation. I think our foundation recognizes there's incredible opportunity across the region, and we've got to figure out how to support people in community, those directly impacted, and build their power over time, provide them with long-term resources, particularly general support resources necessary to build capacity of leaders, of organizations, of networks, and that combination is part of what's necessary to build power. I think women of color in the South are already leading the work. I think about South Carolina and Jenny Russell at the Center for Heirs Property, and I think of Deb McKetty at Community Works, and I think of Michelle Mapp at South Carolina Community Loan Fund. Without an equity lens that acknowledges the importance of having those leaders supported, I think too often philanthropy overlooks smart, effective women, particularly women of color, in positions who are getting it done. I think of South Carolina a lot, partially because there's a network of community economic development practitioners, African American, who have created a network because racism disabled access to economic opportunities for too long. And it felt like philanthropy compounds the problem by not investing in the alternative systems because South Carolina has a reputation as being conservative, or it's got a red state vibe, so we ignore that existing capacity that Michelle and Deb and Jenny represent. So without an equity lens, without an inquiry that acknowledges how gender and race, there are explicit, challenges, and that the sort of solutions we need won't be effective unless we have an equity lens.
And so, of course, we have an interest in getting support in the South, but why now? Is this a particular moment in time? Is it why is the South important now? Why should national foundations or funders be interested in the South?
I would say there is a moment, and the South deserves support whenever we're talking about it, right? So I think they're both true. Well, demographics aren't. Destiny. We hear a lot about the demographic changes that are happening in the South. A return of African American people as well, and with good civic engagement and organizing, it's possible to think differently about electoral outcomes if there's an orientation around building long-term power. So I think the next 10 years matter a lot across the region, not just in the states that are at play, but it also particularly is important in those states that are at play. I also think the South has been this laboratory of aggressive, policy and politics, but it's also been the home to some of the most powerful and important movements for economic, social, racial, and gender justice. And that the seeds of all that work remain in the South. And so with a recognition of that demographic set of transitions and the real capacity that is in the South now, every state we work in the South, 8 out of 10 times there is existing capacity on the ground doing real system change work. Doesn't mean everywhere, and it doesn't look the same across the South or, even within the same states, but there's real capacity there. And I think it takes landing in place and building relationships enough to see what's there.
I actually want to build on that. So one of the challenges, and I think I often hear this, and I've had conversations with funders who are really interested and want to figure out how to support the region, but they have a couple of concerns. One of the concerns are like, where do you start? Where do you engage? Secondly, it comes up often around this question of infrastructure and capacity. I have a particular kind of portfolio I need to support. I've got some framework of what I need to support, and I'm looking for organizations that I can't find organizations that may meet that particular kind of criteria. Like, I'm just interested in kind of your thoughts around how, kind of advice around how they could be engaged in the region.
I just think there are opportunities to learn about place and context, being in a relationship with other, ally funders in the region. I think there is deep change work happening across the South. And what's going on in Appalachia doesn't look like what's going on in South Carolina, but if you've had a chance to take a look at, as the South grows, there are incredible similarities and the challenges. And while the strategies, the work on the ground looks different, there is core commitment to engaging people, listening to those local voices, and developing strategies aimed at building power in place. So I would say we're issue agnostic at the foundation because our goal is to build power. And the work in South Carolina and Louisiana and Appalachia, the consistent thread for us is work aimed to engage people in building their power, and we fund economic transition, economic development, and state policy change in those three regions. But there is that a consistent thread underneath, based on our relationship and following the lead of local work. So I just think there's a ton of capacity, and it takes settling long enough in place to see the opportunity to build connections and relationships to local folk doing good work.
I recently read an article based on a report that was extremely disturbing. In the report, it talks about how African American women are the fastest growing, one, in terms of performance, the voter turnout is higher than anybody else in the country. They're the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs. They're the highest number of people who are actually entering college. But the same report said in the last 10 years, from 2004 to 2014, their earnings decreased by 5%. So I'm like, wait. Decreased. I said, so wait. So let me get this right. So we're going to school, we're starting businesses, we're voting, we're performing. How is it possible that in the last 10 years there's a decrease in the earnings? The status of Black women report, actually, the Institute for Women's Policy, I think, did it. But it was a really disturbing piece. And then another piece around that, specifically with the South, was that in Louisiana, Black women doing the same exact job as white men, as the gap of inequity is greater than anywhere in the country. They make 46 cents on the dollar, 46% of what white men make. And so you see these gross inequities, particularly as it relates to race, but there's this other component in terms of gender. I know that the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation has been very intentional about moving places and people out of poverty. So I'm just interested in terms of you all's strategy. I love the idea. I love the context of being issue agnostic, but I'm just really interested if you can share kind of some of your strategies, or some of the strategies of the foundation, in terms of that intersection between gender and race, particularly thinking about economic opportunity and advancing economic opportunity.
So I would just say we operate with a gender and equity, a gender, a racial, and a class equity lens, not just because we think it's critical to reach disadvantaged folk, but because we think it's a path toward winning, that it's going to take African-American women and new immigrants, it's going to take engaging young women, it's going to take investing in leadership development and organizational development, and building the capacity of those communities. It's going to take understanding the barriers they face specifically. It's going to take understanding those challenges to then design work and organizing strategy and ways to build relationships informed by an understanding of what those challenges are, engaging directly with those communities. So all of those sorts of strategies, we follow our community partners, right, and we believe deeply in their voices, and our job is to give them the capacity to be effective in doing their work.
Thank you for your work. And I want to also acknowledge, if as a national funder, if they're interested in learning more about the South, and
y'all give us a call,
okay,
please. There's no, I'll put my phone number up if that'll help.
And I also want to acknowledge Southern Partners Fund. I want to, are there other Southern regional funders that are in the room? But I know Southern Partners Fund and Mary Reynolds Babcock, and there are two fantastic resources of Foundation Southern Regional. Yes. And the Appalachian Funders Network. They're in the room. Tap into these organizations who have deep roots, have a wealth of experience, have an openness and a willingness to work. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So as we advance to our next section, what we're going to do is we're going to have the opportunity for you to hear from funders who have developed deep relationships, have done investments in the region, and developed these relationships with Southern regional organizations, so you can kind of hear their story. Okay. And so first up, what we're going to have is we're going to have Natalie Collier, who is the director and founder of the Lighthouse. I heard it, woo-woo, at the Margaret Walker Center, and Tanisha McHarris at the Novo Foundation. Let's give them a welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Bo. I'm a call and response baby, so I need to hear you. Hi, everybody. I know it's Friday and it's raining, but we're going to bring the sun in the room. I am really humbled to be in this space. The energy feels really good, which always tells you you're in the right place at the right time. But I'm also really humbled to be sitting next to and on the stage with one of our most amazing and meaningful partners, this Natalie. And so I actually want to spend the really brief time that we have together. Shout outs to whoever is doing the time check. I'm going to apologize ahead of time, but I'm going to try. But I want to jump into Natalie's work, which I think is an incredible, meaningful, powerful example of movement work that's happening in the South that's centering Black girls in particular. But before I jump in to ask Natalie a few questions, just want to quickly share how we got to know Natalie. So Novo, about 2 years ago, announced that we wanted to really deepen our commitment in the U.S., and first, the way to do that is we had to really sit back and learn. And so we wanted to listen directly from girls and the people that care mostly about them, oftentimes women of color in their communities who are either working as volunteers, working after work, before work, during work to really support girls in their communities. And so when Mississippi was our first listening session, and Natalie really made that happen for us. And it was probably one of the most thoughtful listenings we were ever able to do to be able to get to the kind of community members, leaders, and women and girls that we wouldn't otherwise have gotten to without Natalie's leadership. And so just really, I want to, in front of everybody, to say thank you so much, because our commitment now in the Southeast to deepen our work there in 12 particular states is really around partnering with a regional intermediary. What we learned is not only do we need to believe and support and get behind local leadership in movements, we have to get behind and support local philanthropic leadership. And so we are in the process of finding a regional intermediary. So I just want to thank Natalie, because we couldn't have gotten there without being able to thoughtfully listen and having leadership like Natalie help us do that. So thank you. You could clap. You could clap. So, Natalie, I want you to share the work that you do, and specifically the Lighthouse and the work that you're doing to really center Black girls in particular in the South.
Okay, so the Lighthouse was born from about 6 years of doing youth leadership development, specifically with Black girls in the Black Belt of Alabama, Southwest Georgia, and the Mississippi Delta. And through another organization. It came to be, however, can I give a caveat? I either do diplomatic or not at all. So I'm working on my diplomatic, because now there's a comma after my name, and it has director and founder. So I was working at another organization, and as we know, organizations that have become institutions can have very clear ideas about how things should go. And sometimes those clear ideas aren't always necessarily the most amenable to meeting the needs of people. That is particularly the case I found with Black girls in the South. And so I had the opportunity, because of the Novo Foundation, to say, hey, I have this idea. And this is my idea, and it's big, and it's outrageous, big geographically, and I'm just one person. And they said, okay, here's some money, give it a try. And that is one of the things that I think is tremendously important about not only funding work in the South, but particularly for girls and young women of color, is that there is an opportunity for risk. I think that we often don't consider that people with money, people with power don't consider that risk as a luxury. And so what the Novo Foundation has done for me, and this is not me sucking up, right? This is me just keeping it 100, as they say. That what they have given me an opportunity to do is take a risk with something that I think will work, because far too few people are willing to take risks on Black girls in the South. And so that is what the Lighthouse is. So we have there right now for this first year, there is me, a research assistant, and a person who dabbles in communications. And the plan for next year is astronomical compared to what we're doing this year. This year is planning. But we have partnerships so far with 6 universities to do leadership development with young women on college campuses. And I was very clear about the types of young women that I wanted to work with. I wanted Black young women who were overlooked, who didn't have the opportunity to participate in leadership activities on campus. A lot of that has to do with the fact that they don't have measures of academic success. And a lot of times that is a reflection of things that are going on at home, responsibilities that they have. And so one of several of the things that those young women will have access to through the Evans Project. So it's the Lighthouse Black Girl Projects, which even that, everything is intentional. I feel like I'm rambling. I hope it makes sense. But everything is intentional. Like even the Black Girl Projects, it's a play on words, right? Because you think of projects, you think of like, the projects. No, we're taking ugly things and making them beautiful, and helping girls and young women recognize that places that there is beauty even in that, right? The rural places that you live may be destitute. A lot of the places that these young women come from, for the most part, they're not the urban areas that a lot of you may be familiar with. But these are places, these are towns with, 300 people. And it takes 90 minutes to get to a hospital, right? And that's if you have a car. So that even in a place like that, there is beauty. Anyway, that was tangential. But so through that, I'm gonna be quiet so you can ask me another question. But through that, these young women will have access to a therapist, because even with that, we want them to be able to see that seeking help outside of your family and your friends and the church is okay. It doesn't make you crazy. It means that you have access to a resource. They will also have academic support and social support. We'll do monthly webinars. They'll receive a scholarship and stipends. Like, we got a whole little system set up, right? There's also another project, the Mason Project, which is a think tank dedicated specifically to Black girls and young women in the Southeast, which I heard, I don't know if it's true, but I heard that's like not a thing. So why not me do it, right? Our website will launch this month, and the website, which initially was just supposed to be like where you go to find information, even that has turned into a project, so it has a name now. So it's an online platform with like bloggers and podcasters and like, oh my God. So ask me a question, Tanisha.
Thank you. There's so much that you said, but I want to lift up this one particular piece that is tied to something Latasha mentioned earlier, is that way too often we are asking women of color, often Black women, to do the work, and we're not investing in them. And it starts from when they're girls. And so I just wanted to just name the investing in girls' healing as a model to really honor the need to invest in the healing and wellness of women and Black women and women of color. So thank you for that. So you shared a little bit about it earlier on. What advice, thoughts, recommendations do you have for funders who are interested in deepening their work in the South, particularly deepening their work in the South that's really thinking about racial and gender justice and really talking about our girls? So what are your recommendations for funders? Because we talk first and foremost about more money. That is really important. We need more resources. But how we show up in that relationship with that resources is incredibly critical if we're going to make impact, do beautiful, meaningful partnerships, or do harm. So if you could share a little bit how you think funders should show up.
I didn't know you were going to ask me that question, but I have bullet points. Be ye prepared in season and out of season.
I love you.
So I have a few reasons that that foundations should fund in the South, and then just a couple about Black girls, well, girls of color in particular. Let me add this. So a lot of times I will talk about Black girls because that's like who I work with. And when I say girls of color or young women of color, I'm being intentional about my inclusiveness. When I say Black girls, I mean Black girls. Like I am very clear that when I say Black, I don't mean Black and brown. And that is not to be dismissive of anyone, but it is an intentional political statement. I live in a South where there aren't a lot of people of color, right? Jackson, which is where I've lived most of my adult life, the city is almost 80% Black, right? Like the city is like everybody in Jackson is Black. When you go to restaurants, however, all you see is white people. The mayor is Black, the chief of police is Black. Like all of those people are Black, but when you go out, you just see white people. Like you would never know that it was a city that was Black. So when I say Black, I mean Black. And anyway, that's why you should just read your bullet points.
Go ahead, Natalie.
Sorry, Mom.
Shout out to the time checker. We got you.
What reasons should you invest in the South? Here we go. In a lot of ways, we are political trailblazers. Justin kind of referenced this earlier. We are the testing ground for policy, state and federal, that land at your front door. We may not be the most progressive politically, but don't mistake that for a lack of astuteness, ambition, or agility when necessary. What reason should you invest in the South? Because we've seen and been living in hostile conditions. Those of us who've been countering, surviving, and thriving in those same environments are, quite frankly, master teachers of resistance. What some call slow, my Southern self calls deliberate. What reason should you invest in the South? It's a challenge. The work is a challenge, any work is. You will be challenged and stretched beyond what is comfortable for you. You'll hear unfamiliar voices, but recognize the stories are the same with nuance. You'll see the landscape matters. You'll feel that infrastructure or lack thereof makes a difference. In addition to good food, you'll smell that distinct scent of raw opposition mixed with refreshed hope in the air. What reasons should you invest in the South? There is a need. We saw statistics just minutes ago. About less than 1% of philanthropic dollars in the South go specifically to work for girls and women of color, and most of that goes directly to universities and rarely to those directly impacted. If you believe in reparations, it's because we're owed it. We Southerners, particularly people of color, made this land of free and brave possible. If you believe in economic justice, because equity in this context hasn't ever been a thing, and free labor and indentured servitude set that up. If you believe in self-aggrandizement, you'll feel better, and we'll all be better for it. We'll even listen to you brag. And then there's a difference between funding and investing in the South. Funding is giving money. We all know that. That's the old model. Investing is knowing change is slow but lasting, and it requires relationship building, commitment, and accountability in addition to the dollars. I just got two more. Timekeeper, turn your clock off. Invest in Black girls and girls of color, because on just about every indices, Black girls and women fare the worst, except in the few instances where other women of color and impoverished white people who think they're regular white, you heard me say it, but because things are rarely nuanced, divided again, people in this population rarely see that they're one step away from being sociopolitically Black and oftentimes fight harder than any of their racial counterparts against it. I don't even know why I wrote all that. By raising the floor, there we go. Everyone fares better. When we consider such a rationale, it assumes those of us who are doing well can either imagine doing better or are open to the idea that those they deem less than have opportunities and access. Invest in Black girls and other girls of color, because they too deserve the blue skies of wide open windows, the luxury of mistakes that are ultimately inconsequential. They deserve girlhoods that don't rush them out of double Dutch ropes. The girls I've worked with and have walked alongside deserve more than the vocabulary of success. This is kind of like what Latasha was talking about earlier. They deserve more than the vocabulary of success, but the tools for it. These are entitlements. This is my last point. I hope Tanisha has another question. Audre Lorde said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And you don't argue with Audre Lorde. But I want to add something. We must also be mindful to not let the master and his cronies bastardize truth and goodness. An entitlement is a human right. How do we become ashamed to say we have a right to a quality of life, health care, to play, or wear our hair the way we choose? You have to say everything you want to say, because people might not ever invite you back again.
Natalie, that was perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let me give you the Facebook page, and then, because I'm not supposed to give the website out until it has stuff on it, because apparently that's tacky. So it's facebook.com/The Lighthouse MWC. MWC.
So it sounds like
okay.
NCRP will send it out, and it'll once it's up, it will also make sure for those that are on the Grant Makers for Girls of Color listserv, we'll make sure it gets out through there too.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh, thank you for asking. That makes me feel good.
Let's just give some love to Natalie. Thank you. That was brilliant and beautiful. Awesome.
Thank you both. Okay, you gonna bring them up?
So I just actually like to stand up in the middle of a stage, clearly, but I am going to introduce, I'm going to introduce Aliyama from the Ms. Foundation and Cassandra Welchin, who is next to come up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today on this soggy sort of morning day. I want to thank everyone who's in this room, and I want to thank everyone who's participating on this panel. I think that the people on this panel are some of the coolest people that I've met, and I'm so honored and grateful to be here. I work at the Ms. Foundation, and our initial history with the South began with Katrina. We're a public foundation, so we raise money and we give it out, and some of our giving is limited by the resources that we get. And so the Kellogg Foundation supported us for 3 years in investing and supporting organizations that were engaged in supporting women after Katrina. The Mississippi Low-Income Child Care Initiative has been a grantee of ours long before Katrina and during Katrina, and we consider them one of our closest partners out of our grantees. So when I arrived at the foundation 5 or 6 years ago, I had seen some of this work in Katrina, and the data that we saw was also reflective of how the Ms. Foundation was giving in the South. It was a very little portion of our overall grant making was going into the South. And so I wanted to kind of resurrect some of the work that we started in Katrina. And part of that meant, and I'm actually from Philadelphia. We have grits there, but I don't know if it counts as the South. And I'm a metropolitan, urban, northern person. And so I knew a little about the South. And so Tanisha had like a learning tour. I had a talking to. And so I want to recognize Carol Burnett, who's the executive director of Milwaukee. And so, Carol, and they've historically done work on child care for over 30 years in the state. And one of the things I remember they said to me was, for 30 years, we get up every day and we do this fight around child care. But if the state of Mississippi doesn't care about women, why would they care about children? And that started a conversation between us about really how do we lift up and make visible women in Mississippi, particularly women of color, especially Black women. And NFG, the Neighborhood Funders Group, was organizing a learning tour in Mississippi that I was a part of. And during that time, Milwaukee gathered an initial group of community leaders to really talk about what would it look like to elevate women in this state and lead a campaign through a gender lens. And so out of that started the Keeping Mississippi Secure campaign. So I got the button. And so I wanted Cassandra to talk a little bit about sort of the inception, why you thought it was important to invest in women in Mississippi, and talk a little bit more about this campaign.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. It's really good to be up here in New York with all of you who are caring about and thinking about important issues that's dear and near to all of our hearts. These 3 daughters of the South that you're going to be hearing from today. So we really thank you for that. Since 1998, as Aliyama said, the Mississippi Low-Income Child Care Initiative really have been working to advance women's rights around social, economic, political, so they can have full participation in all of those areas. And we've used a number of direct strategies around deep organizing, deep coalition building. We have done a lot of partnerships with unions and the faith community as well, really to advance a policy and an advocacy agenda that will really move women into economic security. And historically, we have been working on child care, but like Aliyama said, if you don't care about women, you don't care about children. And so we began to really have this deep internal conversation internally and then with our partners about what would it look like to really put forth a policy agenda that really put women in the center of our public debate, our policy debate? What would that look like? And so we began to be thought partners with the Ms. Foundation and Aliyama, very intentional, a lot of conversations. And we said, you know, we got to do this. And so we gathered these women to have that conversation. And it was so interesting in that what was very interesting is that you can't do this work without a racial lens, but so many of us do the work without the gender lens. And so we gathered all these women to the table who are, you know, professors, who are activists and elected officials. And we said, we've got to be able to not do this work with a racial lens, but we've got to do it with a gender lens as well. And so we got them in the room, and we said, so let's have the conversation. It was so interesting because the white women in the room said, well, gender is important. I mean, yeah, gender is important. And the black women said, well, no, my race is important. And then we had this amazing woman who's now the chief of staff to our newly elected mayor in Jackson, Mississippi, Chokwe Antar Lumumba. And she said, no, all of it's important. And so we began to really do some truth-telling in that space. And from that birth, this pretty incredible initiative that really put women front and center, where we were able to really do some real truth-telling around race and gender, and then say, let's talk about what women need in the state to be economically secure. And so from there, we began to have conversations all across the state with women, and they informed us on this policy agenda, even though we knew what the issues were, but we needed their voices to overlay that, right? And so we went deep into community, and we said, what is it that you need to be economically secure? And they told us childcare was at the center of everything, because if they don't have childcare, they can't work, right? And so they told us healthcare was important. They told us they needed stronger protections against domestic violence and sexual assault. We had women right there who were running with their families from those violent situations. We heard those stories. College women came up to say, I have 3 jobs, I'm only 19 years old, and I'm paying for college. Can I get some help? So those conversations informed our policy agenda, and we put it before the legislature to begin to create some policies that was responsive to what we heard in community.
And one of the things I want to draw out from this is that, you know, when Cassandra's talking about we talk to women, it was actually 10 town hall meetings throughout the state of Mississippi. Do you want to talk a little bit about that whole process?
Yeah. So, you know, again, Mississippi is very relational, as so many of the states are in the South. And so we partnered with leaders that we had relationships with all across the South to hold town hall meetings. They co-sponsored with us. We partnered with social services agencies that can bring out their constituents, the domestic violence shelters. We partnered with mental health facilities. We really partnered strong with them. We partnered with women organizations and frats and fraternity groups, sorority groups. We partnered really strong with them. And they held these town hall meetings. We had 10 of them across the state, from the top, bottom, east, and west. We had town hall meetings. Their children were in there, was in there as well. And we began to just really hear from them about what those real struggles were that the data says, right? That we also know because we're very much on the ground. But we heard from that. And from those town hall meetings, again, they informed the process. They informed that policy agenda. And so that was the work that we did.
And the final meeting, not the final meeting, the culmination of that year's work took place in a big town hall meeting.
Yes. So I'll talk a little bit about that, because we wanted to, that was just the beginning. And so we wanted to launch the initiative. And so we launched the initiative in Jackson, and we brought a lot of those women from those town hall meetings to Jackson. And we were able to attract Professor Anita Hill. I mean, we all know Anita Hill, right? And so she actually became a thought partner in creating this initiative. She was my professor. And so Carol and I went to Brandeis University, and we said, we got this incredible idea, and we really need you to help us elevate it. Not only did she do that, but she actually helped us be a thought partner in really building out the initiative. She said, well, you need some judges. You got some women judges? I was like, oh, yeah, we need some women judges. I need you to get some women lawyers in the room. Okay, we can do that. And, she began to help us build it out in such an incredible way that we couldn't even imagine. And those women judges began to inform us about what they were seeing in their courtrooms. It was very interesting. And those women, some of those judges, from that initial meeting, we now have a women's leadership team that consists of those judges, right? And they are informing us about what happens in those courtrooms when the women can't pay their debt. And so now they got to go to jail, right? Because they don't have money to pay their debt. And so it was just incredible to have them as a thought partner. So she came to Mississippi with those women in the room, and she actually helped us launch the initiative. And it was really incredible. Of course, we gave her incredible home warming experience. And we had college students. We said, well, we need them to understand who Anita Hill is, and we want to be able to engage these college women. And so we showed her documentary, Anita Hill, on college campuses. And we had these young women at HBCUs, at the law schools, up in Oxford, Mississippi, where James Meredith was shot at and shot. And so they hosted these films on college campuses with Anita Hill. And then when she came, it was just incredible, because we need to be able to bridge that generational gap, because many of them didn't know who she was. And they began to start a dialogue around women and women's wages and harassments, and on college campuses about sexual assault. And so those women are now part of this initiative. So we really began to build that groundwork to have an incredible infrastructure, because what we're after is really leaving a leadership infrastructure in the state. We have one, but we need to build upon it. And so we wanted to be able to go deeper. And so we've been able to really do that.
Yes, thank you. And from when I first started doing this work in Mississippi, and I asked some of my other colleagues about Mississippi, I got this big warning sign, like, don't go there. It's very regressive, and there's no policy wins, right? Like, that's what we're usually focused on, is how fast can you get a policy win. And, in the process of this, there's been some wins, and there's been a lot of losses around policy. But what we were investing in wasn't the policy win. It was to extend and strengthen the infrastructure that's already there in Mississippi. And I think, like, a lot, when I talked to my colleagues, some of them also said that there was no infrastructure. And so when I walk into Mississippi, and Milwaukee has a very particular history. They're not a national network that created an organization in Mississippi. They are sort of weaved into the DNA of Mississippi because they have been in the state for such a long time, and they were able to, bring like all their people to the table in order to create this. So I say to all of you is that when your colleagues say, I'm not sure, I don't know, is really to explore that place of the I don't know, because I think when you scratch the surface, you have so much more that you find there. We've talked a lot about like sort of regressive policies, and how we can the South is our North Star right now in terms of what we can learn and how we can organize in this political moment. Can you share with us, what we can learn from the state of Mississippi and the work that you all do nationally in this political context?
Goes back to what Natalie said. We've been doing this work, in a very hostile environment since the South became the South, right? We've been doing this work, and we have been making incredible strides that goes so deep beyond the surface. What I would say is, what's very interesting is that, Black women in the South, as Tasha said, we've been turning out and we've been showing up and showing out. At the polls in Mississippi, we are the ones that have the highest voter registration in the country. In Mississippi and Louisiana, we turn out women the highest at the polls. And so Carol and I and the organization began to have this conversation. We began to look at these numbers, and we said, it looks like it only takes about 13 to 14% to really change the state. So we began to conjure up, what would a 13% project look like to change the state, particularly if we get new voters, 13% more new voters. And so we've been having that dialogue. If we can get 13% more new voters, we can begin to really change it in a very dramatic way. And so Black women have been showing up and doing that work. And so that's one of the, the really incredible things about, what's happening in Mississippi. That's significant. Like, if we can do that, like, y'all just sit down. Like, it's over. Yeah, it's over. Alabama, Louisiana, we're gonna, we can do that work.
Great. Thank you so much, Cassandra. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you.
I'm so honored to introduce our next speakers. Deon Hayward, Executive Director of Women with a Vision. And Brooke Kelly Green, who's Program Officer here at the Ford Foundation that you heard from.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Again, so happy to be here in this room with you all and to have heard from the previous two sets of speakers who I already was learning a lot from. I want to introduce you all to Deon Haywood. For those of you who do not know Deon Haywood. Yeah, you have some fans, majorly. She's the Executive Director of Women with a Vision, and Women with a Vision has been doing transformative work for women, Black women, but really whoever shows up at their door for almost 30 years now. Deon is a person who, for me, but I imagine for a lot of other people, really challenged my assumptions about the South. I grew up in Southern California, in Los Angeles, and we all think real highly of ourselves there, like real progressive and everything on that politically. And I had a lot of assumptions about what was happening in the South and that it was just all bad. And when I met Deon, I began to learn that those assumptions could not be more wrong. It's not a place of deficit. It's a place of incredible organizing. In fact, a hotbed of creative organizing based on relationships, building those relationships over time and led by community. And what I've seen, and probably what other folks have seen, and why we love you so much, Deon, is because all of that organizing leads to some serious wins, hard wins for people who don't usually get to win anything. So, Deon Haywood, we're really happy to have you here today. I'm excited. I'd love to just have you talk a little bit about yourself and how you bring yourself to your work at Women with a Vision. Start us out.
Hey, Brooke. Hey, y'all. So first, I'm going to say that this is the best way I could return after being on a medical sabbatical from breast cancer. So, yeah. So what better way to be cancer-free and talk about the things I love, Black women in the South, movement work, and justice and liberation. So a little bit about me. Born and raised in New Orleans. And I always tell people that New Orleans is urban yet rural. Those two have to go together if you know anything about New Orleans, right? And so I was born and raised. My grandmother was a little Creole lady who was from the river parishes, and my grandfather was from Tunica, Louisiana. And so I know rural life, and I know that urban rural life. well. Growing up in the South and knowing both parts, the freedom of being in the most progressive city in this, one of the most progressive cities in the South, because New Orleans is that little blue spot in the red state. Growing up, it was amazing to me. It was amazing because I had a sense of what rural community looked like and what urban community looked like, and organizing and being a part of that, and just being raised by really strong women. As I got older, I was a teen mom, and my first real job, and I call it my real job because it was at the National Council of Negro Women. And so when we talk about leadership, and this is the reason I chose to share this part, is I went there because I had 2 kids, and they had this program like, do you know where you want to go? I said, well, let me see if they know where I want to go. So I went and I spent a week in these amazing kind of workshops on careers, what you want to do, where you want to be. And I was like, I had just turned 19. And on Friday was the last day, and they had the little, lunch, and we finished, and they were like, what direction? And they was like, before you leave, our executive director, Emma Broman, would like to meet with you. Now, I had met Ms. Broman, and you ever meet somebody and they're just so big to you that you just want to fit and figure out how you can be next to them? How can you fit in that bigness? And I was like, I want to be like her. And a friend of mine who was with me, and we were like, we're going to become social workers, and we're going to take her job. That was our thing. But she asked to meet with us, myself and my friend. And we were like, girl, what you want us? And she said, Dion, you want a job? I was like, a job? Me? A job? She's like, there's something about you that I feel like you need to be in this space. And she asked the same question to my friend, and we were like, girl, we just got a job at the National, we are part of NCNW. Okay, historic. And that was my beginning to who I feel like I am today. Sadly to say, my friend Larissa was raped and murdered when we were 21. And she too had children, because that was NCNW's focus, young women and children. And the need to do more became greater for me. Not just by what happened to her, but also I had an aunt that was stabbed and raped in her home when I was 14. And so when you talk about, yes, these things happen all over the world, but there's something unique about being in the South because justice is never really served in the South. And so early on, I knew that that was something that I had to fight for. And someone had given me an opportunity for a playground. Someone gave me a space to be, and that was Emma Broman. Whatever she saw, I never got a chance to ask her what she saw, but I wish I knew. I wish I could show her today. Even so, she saw some of it, but it was because of her, she saw this Black girl. She just didn't see some child who thinks she's a lesbian, which I know now that I am. She just didn't see that in this person with 2 children. She didn't see me as society saw me, which is, for Black women, invisible, nothing, no future, no nothing. She saw something. And I am forever grateful, and that is why Women with a Vision is in my heart. So Women with a Vision was started by 8 women who were all social workers. There must be something about that social work, who decided they needed to do something about the HIV epidemic in the late 80s in New Orleans. And they started the organization, and they decided no one was paying attention to Black women. They talking about sex, they talking about drugs, and nobody's paying attention. And so I, at the time, was like when we're at NCNW, but also paying attention to this group, who my mother was actually one of the founders. And so that was kind of like my groundwork and my moving in. I didn't come to Women with a Vision until they became incorporated, because they weren't in the beginning. And I quit my job at the Office of Public Health because I hated it, and it wasn't moving nothing for me. There was no leadership. There was no way to build. and move my people. So I left and I started working. I was the first full-time employee of Women with a Vision at the time. And so from there to now, it's one of the reasons we always say in Women with a Vision, everyone in Women with a Vision, we are at the core of the work and all the things we fight for because we know it personally. So
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Love to hear a little bit more about how Women with a Vision started, but also how it's grown. You know, you started as a local service organization, really doing outreach, kind of grew into doing some policy advocacy work that was transformative. It got you national attention, global attention as a human rights defender, which you are. You know, I've seen the work grow from providing services to advocacy and litigation to now, you know, Women with a Vision is playing this really pivotal role statewide in Louisiana, doing voter engagement with Black women, not only in the city, but also in rural areas of Louisiana where there are a lot of Black women who cannot wait to be engaged in this work. So just a little bit about how an organization like Women with a Vision begins and then grows into what it is today.
So when we started, and you know, whenever I talked to our foremothers, they was like, yeah, this is nice. We never wanted to do all this you're doing. We just wanted to be in community with the people. They didn't have an office. We didn't have an office for a long time, and people sure didn't believe in the work. Because who are these Black women talking about organizing, and not really organizing, but doing work for Black people? And at that time, there was no funder, there was no one who believed that service, advocacy, and policy could go together. No one believed in 1991 that that was a marriage. And so when we started out, they did start out doing HIV prevention and harm reduction. We were probably the only people in the South doing harm reduction at the time. We actually came up here to New York. We met with Harm Reduction Coalition here in New York. We went to visit Dan Briggs in Chicago, Dave Purchase. These are like the grandfathers of harm reduction. And we learned what harm reduction was, and we took it back to the South. And we operated an underground needle exchange to this day, because it's still not legal. But we just do it in ways that people don't bother us anymore. But we realized that for all the programs and initiative that CDC put out around how we were going to fight HIV, we never believed in them. We never thought that was going to work, and it still, in some ways, hasn't worked. Because it really wasn't touching, at its core, it wasn't getting at the root of the issue, right? It's those things we know now as the social determinants of health. But if people don't have education, and if people don't have, and I won't go through all the list of all the things we know people need, then how can they move past this point, right? And so we would always enter meetings saying we work with the people everybody else is ashamed to work with. Drug users, yes, those are our people. Women who identify or don't identify in sex work but engage in sex work, yes, those are our people. And understanding that sex work wasn't this thing that you saw on TV, it sure as hell wasn't Pretty Woman, that it was survival. It was, I have a job as a housekeeper, especially throughout the South when a lot of the jobs are around hospitality and tourism. Pays no money. And so I might do this on the side to get through. And so fast forward, there was post-Katrina, of course, brought a lot of things to surface. But Louisiana had this law called Crime Against Nature. And it's an over 200-year-old law, and people had used it haphazardly over the years. But post-Katrina, you know, the federal government gave Bobby Jindal a whole lot of money to target violent offenders. And y'all know that when they say violent offenders, those are never the people they get. It's always the low-hanging fruit. And who's low-hanging fruit? Black women, trans women, queer people. Those are low-hanging fruit. And so we decided to challenge this law because so many of our clients and people in community were being charged. Now, crime against nature is a little unique, but this is Louisiana, is that you are not only charged, it's not only a felony conviction, but you also, at that time, had to put sex offender on your state ID or driver's license. So I want you to think about how you use that, how you have to access services and a job. And so how this, in fact, locked out a huge amount of people. And so we decided to challenge this law, and we did, and we won. And it ended up, thank you. And it ended up removing like over 700 people. And to this day, we're still removing people from that sex offender registry, right? But what was amazing about that, because we sat down and we were like, well, where do we go from here? And then the community asked. We do nothing at Women with a Vision without the community's input. And what the community said, so Ms. Dion, what we doing now? What we fighting for next? And so that, the light bulb went off. It was like, okay, these women are not just happy to be free. They want to see what else we can do to be free and how we going to get everybody else free. And so we began to engage community, and we made sure we always did voter registration. We challenged, so, we were like, wait a minute, we have a legislative win, and I thought that was something that happened all the time. People say, no, that don't. I say, wait, in Louisiana, that place people don't fund. The place that funders have told me, well, y'all don't win. It's just a hard battleground. I've been told that to my face by funders. And I was like, well, yes, this must mean this is going to be so good for us. And it wasn't. It took a while, y'all. It took a while. But it didn't stop. We just continued to organize and work on other issues, and we just started looking at how policy played a role in people's everyday life. How, when the people speak, if you put enough black women in a van and take them to the Capitol, you'll make change. You'll make change. And so then we started looking at the people who are creating these laws and the people who are fighting us to not change them. And that's when we realized, oh, okay, so we need voters. Oh, you need to go. And so this is how we've gone from basically doing prevention and harm reduction to policy, advocacy, knocking down bills, registering women to vote, and then hiring the people who we use as canvassers for our voter engagement work are the very women that are and can identify as sex workers or women who use drugs. It's like we want them to feel what it's like when you win. I don't want to win for them. I want to win with them. Did that answer your question, Brooke?
I think so.
Okay. I get carried away.
I think we're about at time, so I just want to ask something that you've already started to answer, but why Louisiana? And similar to Alayama and Cassandra's conversation, it's a deep South state. People don't think you can do a lot there. Why should we invest there?
Well, one, I'm there. And I said that because I have been, I know what it feels like to be told no, and that y'all don't win. And I mean, y'all are a group of black women. I mean, and y'all are so small. I mean, I've heard it. And so what I would tell you is, this is what it looks like. My organization is what it looks like when you invest in black women, when you invest in leadership, when you invest in trusting the very people who are at its core suffering from the things you say you want to change. And so when I think about Louisiana, I think about, and I'm going to share this real quickly, I think about when the work became statewide, right? When we were traveling to Karen Crow, Louisiana, and Lafayette, Louisiana, and we were ready as an organization, bringing all our stuff, and we're going to educate. Them women came in the door ready. They was like, so you opening up an office here? I was like, well, wait. They were like, because this is what we need. This is what they came ready. And so we are living in an extremely unique time in our history, that the very people who the media will tell you is disengaged is very engaged. Always is alternative facts, y'all know. But we win. And it is, and we've said it, it's really, I would love funders to know it's not just about the win. It's not about the win, because they happen, but they happen over time. They happen when we get people who walk in our door and say, I would love to be a canvasser. We do a thing called the feminist front porch, the Black feminist front porch talk. And we have women who come on their lunch break from hospitals. They're like, we don't know nothing about Women with a Vision, but somebody said we should come sit on this front porch. And so it's about the amazing things that happen when people move together. It's about us knowing that an investment, if you want a rich and full investment, it is knowing that change, it may not, you probably can't even, like we struggle in terms of like, how do we make this work for people? What does the data look like? Because these are not the things that most people measure. Trust me to measure it and watch what I can give you. So to me, that is why you should make an investment. Because if we can change a law that was all around sex, really targeting poor people in sex work in the most conservative and racist state in this country, then trust us to move other things. Thank you.